Well, good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you into the first day of our 3-day series for Serving the Wounded webinar series put on by Samaritan Counseling Services. And we want to welcome everybody in. If you will, as you come in, if you haven't already done so, start utilizing the chat box and just introduce yourselves, where you're coming from. If you want to tell us what ministry that you serve in, and anything else you want to tell us about yourself. We have a co-host, Linda Martin, who's going to be managing the chat box for us today. So as we go through the webinar, I want to let you know you can put any dialogue in there, ask any questions that Linda can immediately converse with you about. We'll get into some other things about how to dialogue with us today as we go forward with this. I will now want to bring in and introduce to you our two panelists for today. We have actually a team of 5 panelists who are going to be on the series with us from today, tomorrow, and Thursday. And today, our two panelists are Amanda Crump, who works at Children's Therapy Solutions here in Bradenton, and Melissa Carlson, who is one of our therapists at Samaritan Counseling Services of the Gulf Coast. If you're not familiar with Samaritan, we're going to give you information throughout these 3 days so you can get familiar with us a little bit more. But right now, because we have a lot of content to cover today, I'm just going to jump right in to our content for today. But before I do that, let me just ask you, first of all, I'm going to ask our co-host Linda to launch a poll for us. We're going to have a couple of polls each day just to interact a little bit differently. So this first one is called Summer, and it's just a couple of questions. Linda, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll, a couple of questions about what summer has been like for you and how ministry is going for you. So we'll have that poll up for a moment, and you can interact with that as we take a couple of moments to give you some other instructions. There's a Q&A box as well for you to interact with us. And here's what I would like for you to do. If you would like immediate questions, there's a poll, by the way. So you got 2 questions, and feel free to do the multiple choice on that first question. For ministry this summer has been, fill in the blank. And then if you could vacation wherever you want, take your pick between the beach or a cruise or the mountain. Answer those questions, and then we will share the results in just a second. But the Q&A, I want to sort of reserve that separately from the chat box. And if you'll put questions in there that you would like for us to get to at the end of our presentation today, we're going to reserve as much time as we can just to dialogue with those questions. So if you want to use both of those, the chat box and the Q&A, that would be great. Take a couple more seconds if you haven't already answered the poll question, and answer how your summer's been for you and where you would like to vacation. I'm going on vacation next week. I'm not going on to the beach, and I'm not taking a cruise, but I am going to the mountains. So there you go. That's what I'm doing next week. All right, Linda, if you'll close that poll for us and then just share the results so we can see what everybody said about how their summer has been and what their vacation preference would be. I appreciate y'all doing that. We're going to have another poll a little later, and that's cool for us to be able to interact like that. That's awesome. Thanks, Nancy. Been busy and getting to the mountains. That would be, there you go. That's probably everybody's description. So we're going to close that poll now, and I'm going to start sharing our screen with our PowerPoint to let you start walking through with us what we want to talk about today. And today we are doing a general overview of what trauma-informed means, and try to give you some practical thoughts, just general thoughts about you as a ministry leader, whether that's you're in a church, whether you're in a ministry that's outside of a church, whoever you're serving. We're here to help us talk about what that looks like and how many people you're probably talking about that have experienced wounds and trauma, and to help us all be informed as we are using that term a lot. So let me start sharing our screen here. This is just to welcome you again to our series that's today and tomorrow. By the way, if you know someone as you're engaging with this content today, and you know someone's like, man, I wish they were hearing this, just know two things. One, it's not too late for them to register for tomorrow or Wednesday. And also, we're recording these and we will post these on our YouTube channel, and I'll be able to send those links to you later so you can find those. So today I'm going to do some quick introduction kind of things and then start asking Amanda and Melissa to share with us their thoughts and their knowledge about this topic. And first, I just want to share that the direction of this webinar series is our effort to try to connect the silos between the faith community and mental health services. If you just think back, maybe even just 10 years ago, how separated those two entities, silos were. We've come a little bit of ways to bring those together, but we know there's a lot of work that still could be done for faith communities and mental health services to really partner together. And that's one effort of this webinar series, is to help us bring those two silos together. And as we're doing that, we have a lot of resources that I'm going to be throwing at you here in our PowerPoint. And one of those here is from, you see there on the slide, from Church Pulse Weekly Conversations. That's with Dr. Carrie Newhoff, pastor, and one of the leaders at Barna Group. And they had an episode that Dr. Terry Wardle sat in on. And he made these thoughts that I wanted to just highlight for us as we ease our way into what woundedness and trauma means. He said that wounds create false beliefs, and then false beliefs create emotional upheaval. That emotional upheaval then drives us to dysfunction. We tend to pay attention to all the dysfunction, which is very normal. What we are encouraging us to do, and as we're going to talk about, is how to go deeper than that and look at the symptoms of what is causing that dysfunction as we talk about wounds and talk about trauma. And speaking of trauma, I was talking with a colleague from another Samaritan center as we were planning this, and he said, "John, did you know there's only one word in scripture that's translated trauma, and it's in the book of Luke, the story of the Good Samaritan?" It's like, no, I did not know that. And it's from, you see it on the screen, Luke 10:34, where it says the Good Samaritan went to the wounded person and he said he went to him and bandaged his wounds. And in the Greek, that original word is actually the word trauma. So as we talk about wounds, and as we talk about trauma, we're interplaying those two words together, intersecting them two together. And it may be that as a leader, it's maybe a thought to you like, I don't really deal with trauma. I don't have a whole lot of people dealing with trauma. That's our hope today, is to help you to see you probably do. And we want to open our eyes to how much there is and what that looks like, and to help us have good messaging. This is not meant to slam this particular church, but we have a message to send out to our communities. And I think we see what they were trying to say with their message at this church. We love hurting people. You could twist that and say, not sure that they said that in the best way. So we want to make sure that as we're serving and as we're ministering to all the people that God has brought into our churches and into our different ministries that we have, that we really are loving them where they are and meeting them where they are. So to get us started in all this conversation, I want to ask Melissa to help us talk about this particular definition that comes from a resource called Resource Guide by the Crisis Prevention Institute. And we're going to start here and define what trauma-informed care is and work our way down into just talking about trauma today. We're going to give symptoms and types. And so as we look at this, Melissa, on this slide here, just defining what trauma-informed care is, what stands out to you as things we need to note here off of this definition of trauma-informed care? You're muted. Yes.
What really stands out to me is that these are interventions directed by a thorough understanding of the profound neurological, biological, psychological, and social effects that trauma has on an individual. And I would also add spiritual effects. They have a high need for safety in all the ways that are shown on the slide. And that's a tall order for anybody, even trained people, to try to provide that. So I was thinking that it's important to know your resources, know who you can turn to if you start to get overwhelmed or if someone in your congregation needs more than what you can comfortably provide. That
Yes, no
is
doubt.
all part of trauma informed.
Exactly. And by the way, listeners, we're treating this as more of a conversation today. And so as Amanda and Melissa come in and out, it's gonna sound like we're having a conversation. And your way to engage in that is through the chat box and through the Q&A. So yeah, Melissa, this is so helpful to us to help us start at the top of just what trauma informed care is. And then Amanda, on this next slide, we have a definition of just trauma informed, which I'm going to plug this book that you see on the side there, Hope Rising, written by Casey Gwynn and Chad Hellman. I'm going to trump this for all 3 days of our conversation here because they were so helpful in helping us in ministry land talk about and understand trauma and then how to help people. So, Amanda, as you look at this definition that they have of trauma informed, we've underlined what has happened to them instead of focusing on what is wrong with them. Why is that so important?
I think, as Melissa stated, trauma can impact our entire being, all those different areas that she pointed out. And we're going to learn here in a few minutes how really that starts from the brain. And so I think when we just take this perspective of being able to see it through the lens of trauma, we can understand that part of how we're wired as human beings, how God created us, is to make predictions about what's going to happen based on what has happened to us. And so being able to understand, like it says in the definition, those natural reactions that we have, even if the way John and Melissa might respond to something is different for them than how I would respond, it's still that natural God-given reaction that we have. And so through our trauma-informed lens, we really want to be able to just help people process the things that they've gone through or the experiences that they've had that have kind of helped to shape some protective responses that they might have, instead of focusing on maybe those symptoms that we see or those character traits that might be assigned to them unknowingly.
Right, all the dysfunction that Dr. Wardle talked about, right? And which is so easy. So what you just said, I think, is incredibly helpful to us to recognize everybody responds differently. And if we can start there, meet people where they are. And this statement here, also from Hope Rising, says once we make the trauma-informed shift from what is wrong to what has happened, then we can help people start moving toward healing and moving toward hope. And that's really what we want to be about and help all of us move forward in that. I'm going to go ahead and take us now to trauma-informed care, to trauma-informed, and give us a little thought about what it means to you, as to all of us actually as leaders. Again, this is from Hope Rising. So when a trauma-informed leader will patiently, carefully, lovingly meet people where they are, focus on what is behind statements and behavior, the symptoms of the real issues, that's when we're doing this leadership well. What's important, Amanda, I'm coming back to you. What's important here, the words you see on this screen about our position, our opportunities as leaders?
I think obviously the audience that we're interacting with today is from a ministry and a church standpoint. I'm actually a minister's kid. My dad is a minister of music, and so I think especially in the church culture, you hear about disagreements within congregations or varying opinions. Again, we can, I think, project that onto all of society, right? Like this is something that doesn't just apply in the church setting, but this trauma-informed approach applies to everything we do in the community. Hence the reason we've seen a rise in just trauma-informed community awareness.
Yes.
But as we talk today specifically about the church and meeting spiritual needs, I just think it's really important that we kind of fall back on that foundation of why we're doing what we're doing. And so we're all here by God's grace, right? And that's for all of us. And as John alluded to earlier, we all have wounds, we all have traumas, even if we don't see that. And so kind of taking that humble approach as a ministry leader, as a business owner, whatever capacity you might be in, I think that's really what that trauma informed means. is showing some of these characteristics that it points to in this definition.
Definitely. By the way, I'm just going to keep encouraging you to converse in the chat box. What you just heard Amanda say about how this plays out in church uh, events, church goings, programming, decision making, you might have some thoughts to share of how that's going at your church or just questions about that. That's why Linda's there, just to engage you and for y'all to engage each other about that. So we've talked about trauma-informed care and gave a little more definition to what trauma-informed means. So now, Melissa, let's narrow that down and just talk about the word trauma. And we're coming at this, another great resource that we've come across as we prepared for this webinar. You see there mentioned on the screen is Trauma in America. And I'll give you an understanding of what that is. It's a report that Barna Group put out. You can go Google that if you want to right now, but they put that out as commissioned by the American Bible Society. And the purpose of their research and the report is to show what trauma in America looks like, but also how the church can come alongside that and minister to people. So this resource is really, really good. And this is the definition that they had of trauma. So Melissa, it might sound redundant, but as you look at their definition, what's important that as we read this here?
Well, I think the whole thing is important. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read it.
Sure.
Physical, psychological, or emotional experience or series of experiences that produce a response of intense fear, helplessness, horror, or the feeling or actuality of a threat to the person's well-being that lasts for more than a few weeks. I think the two slides before this and this one are really important because they underscore the traumatized person's need for safety. And as leaders in the community or in our congregations, we can help to provide that safety if we understand these things. For example, repeating their story over and over and over might be tedious for somebody, but the traumatized person actually needs to do that to be able to move a little farther along in their ability to accept what has happened and the help that they need. And so it starts kind of top down. Their brains are going and move down, but the real work happens with people who can help them from the bottom up with the signs that are showing up related to fear, helplessness, and that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, and it not only, and Melissa, you've already alluded to this, this definition has physical, psychological, and emotional. I'm going to show on our next screen another statement in Trauma in America that this just blew me away when I read this because I'm like, that is so true. I just haven't thought about it like that. Abuse of any kind is also spiritual abuse. And the reason why is the way that a person thinks about themselves and the way they think about God is impacted. Speak to that for a moment, Melissa.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that slide for making that the focus. And I want to reassert something that's really obvious, but still, God does not endorse abuse. And the more damaged our spirits become under consistent trauma, whatever kind of abuse it might be, the less able we are to recover. We literally get diminished and crushed. So people may become afraid of God, they may hate him, but we can't make that an assumption because some people naturally turn to God. And it's not a defense or an avoidance, it's real for them. So discernment is also necessary. Who are we talking to? What do we already know about them? Those kinds of things are important to consider.
That's really good. Before we leave this slide and start talking about types of trauma, Amber, just want to invite you in to see if you're having any thoughts you want to share with us about the definition of trauma and the spiritual aspect of it.
No, I think Melissa is explaining it really well to us, just as a reminder of, and I know we're going to talk about statistics soon, but just how common this is. It's not a big grand, ICD-10 code diagnosis that we're talking about, but this is just normal everyday life things that people experience.
Yeah, so let's look at
Unfortunately.
that. On this next slide, we're now going to talk, Melissa's going to talk us through this, the types of trauma. This is coming from the resource guide again from the Crisis Prevention Institute. This is a clinical type of definition. We're going to have a different slide with some more layman's definition. So Melissa, if you'll just talk through these 3 different types that they describe here.
I thought maybe the best way to do this would be to give an example. And
Great.
an example of an acute trauma might be a bomb goes off, or you witness or experience a car accident, something like that. A complex trauma is usually considered repeated exposure to an individual traumatic situation, or it could be a long-lasting trauma like a kidnapping or incarceration, something like that. Crossover trauma could be a single event like the building that collapsed in Miami a few weeks ago.
That's a great
Actually,
example.
all these types of trauma, I'm sure, are present there, but it's a pretty good example of a single traumatic event that was so big. We know right off the bat that the mental health issues of trauma are going to be there for a long time.
That's right. Those are great examples. And now, Amanda, if you'll help us on this next slide, we're going to by the way, panel attendees, Amanda was referred to me as someone who's done trauma-informed care training and stuff. And when we met the first time, she said, there's big T's and little T's. I'm like, please explain. So she's going to help us with that. What we mean by small T's and big T's in this slide, I think is really helpful. Amanda, talk us through this particular stuff here.
Yeah, so this is, again, we just want to make sure that we're giving information, for myself included, sometimes gets very medical model or, jumbled with words and acronyms. So this is one way that I heard it described several years ago, was literally just like a lowercase t and an uppercase T, as far as a small or little t and a big T. I think it's important to note, especially on this slide and when we talk about this concept, although I can give you some examples about what falls into each category, that isn't solid and solidified, because
Sure.
again, the way each individual responds based on their own history, their own past experiences, how their brain is wired, something we might see as a small t and encourage them just to get over it and move on might actually really be a big T in their life, and they might need additional supports or services. So I think that's important to remember even when we're using this kind of analogy. But things that would fall into the category of a small T would potentially be some of those more one-time events, or things that might still be traumatic, but not as challenging as big T's, again, per this definition. So like loss of significant relationship, you see there, financial challenges, also things like a non-life threatening injury or accident. So things like that might cause an acute or a momentary stress disorder, versus the big T. Melissa gave us some examples, and you see them there listed too, things that we think of as trauma. So I think this slide really reminds us that some of those seemingly daily life encounters, whether it's relationships or money, all those things really do fall under the category of trauma. And so when those begin to pile up and layer up, those little T's can be just as significant as some of the big T's. And so really when we see those compounded together is typically where people might need more support or encouragement.
Definitely. A couple of thoughts here, attendees. I see some of you are chatting in the box. I can't see what you're actually saying because I'm sharing my screen. That's why Linda's there. But maybe give some examples of what you think big T's and small T's are, and have some dialogue about that. I do want to reference at the bottom where you see that spectrum line between acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, that recently we had a two-part series about PTSD that one of our other panelists did. So when you get the link to our YouTube channel, you can look at those videos if you want to particularly zero in on that. So those are two thoughts about definitions of types. And here's just a list of types that this list could go on and on and on, as we've already heard from Amanda and Melissa. But just thinking about all of these different types, again, this is from Trauma in America, but you can see the potential of people that sit in your pews or walk through your doors, that this stuff has happened in their lives, or maybe someone close to them, this has happened in their lives. And we want to give you now a statistic how often that Trauma in America, their research showed that, I shouldn't say how often, just what the percentage is of people. This slide that in a 200-person congregation, on average, 40 will have experienced what we're talking about. Just under half of them are likely to have experienced domestic, physical, or sexual abuse. So if you just think, if you were in church this past Sunday or the last time you were there, this is a 20% number is what we're talking about. And that, I believe, and I'm going to ask Melissa and Amanda to give your thoughts on this. I believe that number is probably a little low, particularly if for those of you who are ministry leaders who maybe you're really targeting trauma, um, trauma impacted
Thank
people,
you.
that number is going to be much different. Melissa, what do you think about that?
Yeah, if I may jump in, I certainly agree with that. I think trauma is underreported, partly because people don't understand it. And
Mhm.
leadership, people in leadership positions can help people understand, well, you might not have thought that was traumatic, but it sounds like it was, and this is why it sounds that way. So I think lack of education, sometimes shame or embarrassment, depending on what the trauma is, prevents people from speaking up or reporting. So I do think this is a low number. Yeah.
Amanda, what do you think about that number?
I agree for the same reasons she pointed out, and I think too, especially in the church setting, especially if you're thinking about individuals and in the adult population, unless you're having those really close, intimate relationships, this probably isn't something someone's going to share, obviously, in a whole Sunday morning group, or even like that small, Bible study kind of age or size. So I think it probably just doesn't come up in conversation a lot, Melissa, unless we really are getting down to those more individualized, vulnerable relationships.
Right. That makes
Yeah.
sense.
So we want to mention one other thing about trauma before we start talking about symptoms, and that is what vicarious trauma is. And you've probably maybe heard it, the term compassion fatigue. And this is when, and all of us, if we're in leadership, we have the potential to be involved, to experience this, I should say. And Melissa, I want you to share about this, because I can only imagine, as a therapist who's been doing the working with people for so long, you've seen a lot of vicarious trauma. Is that right?
I've seen a lot of vicarious trauma and I've experienced vicarious trauma. You can't prevent it. So it's not something to be afraid of. It's just something to be aware of. It often goes unnoticed. I've recently discovered that certain aspects of coming back to life, so to speak, as the pandemic is winding down, I can't say they're traumatic for me, but the vicarious trauma added to the little bit I probably do have because of working with my clients on these issues has started to add up, and it shows up in little ways, um, which are probably not, this isn't the right time to mention them, but leaders can ask people, what they need. What do you need to help you with this? You might need time off. You might just need, let's meet for lunch every Monday for a couple of weeks. They're pretty simple ways often to help with vicarious trauma, but that depends on what the original trauma was.
Yeah, for sure. And we wanted to mention this because this isn't just about the people that you're serving, this is about you as well. All of us need to be aware and need to be trauma informed so that we can take care of ourselves and better serve those that we're trying to serve. So being aware of what vicarious trauma is and then how what it does produce in us. So on this slide, this again are thoughts from Hope Rising, that book. Stress and tension, anxiety, preoccupation with others' experiences. I can imagine that we all are tempted to do that. Numb feelings, persistent state of hypervigilance. I know that in my 20 plus years of serving on church staff, I've experienced many of those things. Did it cross my mind that it was from vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue? Sometimes, but not all the time. And that's why we want to bring this up. And let's talk further now about this is leading us in just a moment to talk about symptoms. But Amanda mentioned earlier, let's think about the brain and what trauma does to the brain. So this slide is provided by Dr. Kinsler, a psychologist in the Tampa area, from another trauma webinar that I attended. And I thought it was so helpful to us to have a good understanding of how the experience of trauma is actually stored in our brains. Amanda, there's so much we could say about this, do probably a 45-minute talk on this slide, but what would you tell us is important to note here?
I think as we first just glance at this slide, just a basic reminder of all the things that the brain is responsible for. It is in charge of everything. It controls
Right.
our entire body, not just physically, but helps us process language. It's our sensory system. So I think this just gives us that visual reminder of how complex God wired us and made us. I think when we think about the brain and its job, though, I once heard that the brain has two jobs. One is to protect us and keep us safe, and the other is to grow and learn. The brain cannot do both of those at the same time. So if a person is in a situation where they're having to protect themselves or they have that feeling of protecting themselves, um, their brain isn't really available for growing and learning at that time. And so when we see there on the slide, the part that is kind of gray, which is the brain stem, and then even the blue part, all of that part of our brain is primitive and it's hardwired at birth. So we can get into, the names, the amygdala, the hippocampus, all those things, but really what it is those things that God gave us. So think about a baby and all the things that they do. They have a desire to eat, to sleep. They have that fight, flight, or freeze, right? They're already crying to tell you something's wrong. They're trying to protect themselves. They're hungry. They're letting you know that. So those things are hardwired at birth. And what happens, we know just from neuroscience and psychology, is that the more our brain does something, the better it gets at it, right? And so for our children or our adults who've been in repeated fearful experiences, that part of their brain, which is supposed to be pretty small in all reality, you can see the proportions there, it grows and develops too big. And so something that really shouldn't send us into fight, flight, or freeze might actually do that because that part of our brain has gotten really good at its job. And so just remembering that those past experiences make future predictions. And so we think about, that can be physical, obviously. So if a person, let's say, was walking in a dark alley and was unfortunately attacked, from then on, it's probably going to be really challenging for them to walk in a dark alley, right? Because their sensory system, their brain is going to make a prediction. Oh, last time I did this, this is what happened. So it's going to happen again, right? And so that's we get that understanding. But what about somebody who had a really close relationship with a best friend and then something happened so that ended? So now that person has trouble getting close to people because their brain is telling them, if you get close to someone, it's going to just end. Something's going to happen. It's going to be abrupt and you're going to have that loss again. And so I think if we think about it with those obvious things that we think of when it comes to physical protection, but then also how it relates to relational, which is what we deal with a lot in the church setting, right? And then how that again has those spiritual implications. So our God made the brain so complex, we can see here, but it really has that protective instinct too, to help us protect ourselves.
Definitely. Tomorrow, viewers, we're going to get deeper into some other things as far, and Amanda touched on this a little bit, of the child's brain's development and how that does impact us. So no, we're going to keep coming back to this so we can understand this is what trauma informed is, what happens to our brains and then how that can play out. And interesting to note here that as we listen to all these thoughts and our brains are sitting in this is a very true statement, what you see now on the screen, that trauma is rarely a one-time occurrence. Expect to deal with an array of traumatic events and symptoms. So even if we're going to talk tomorrow about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the challenges that we're talking about today, they're multiplied, obviously, the more that they happen. Amanda, I know that's hard to really tell us. So what happens in the brain when all that happens? But this truth here is really important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it just goes back to the previous slide with the more your brain does something, the better it gets at it. So that could be protecting itself, that could be throwing tantrums, that could be living in dysfunction, like we just get comfortable sometimes, and not physically comfortable, but you know what I mean? Our brain likes to rest in that area because that's where what it's used to.
Right.
If I could just jump in for a second, I think another slice of the prism, so to speak, is that everything we do one way or another is for our survival. It's that primitive when trauma gets set up, or when you see somebody maybe exhibiting some dysfunctional type behaviors, there's a reason they're doing it. And if that person can be met with love and understanding, or the desire to understand, then healing is possible. And the way God works, the healing will probably be for both people, the one who intervenes and the one who had the trauma.
No doubt.
Another way,
Go ahead, Amanda.
Another way that I read this slide when we first were planning is that it's not just the layers of those traumas, but it really is a lifelong journey. So even if your big T happened when you were a child, that you can process that trauma, you can discuss with professionals, and you can make progress and have hope. I know that's a word of the day.
Right.
But there might still be developmental milestones or life markers that resurface some of those. And so I think that's important too, because I think sometimes, unfortunately, our society has kind of like a get over it mentality. If I'm just being honest, like that happened to you so long ago. Like, why is that upsetting now? But really remembering that it's a process. And so having compassion and a trauma-informed lens, even if it's a long process.
That's right. And just to reiterate the statement you said earlier, that everybody goes through this differently. We respond differently. So that means the length of time for healing is going to be different. It's really, really important. To move us into some thoughts about symptoms, you've already heard some thoughts, but just to see it on the screen here, and this is a very short list, but sleeplessness, anxiety, difficult feeling close to loved ones. Amanda mentioned that already. I just want to ask Melissa, that bottom bullet point says intrusive thoughts. Help us know what that means. What are intrusive thoughts?
Intrusive thoughts, I think of them in at least two different ways. Sometimes it's like somebody just shoved a thought into my mind and it takes over everything else. That's one way of having or experiencing an intrusive thought. But another really common way is to not be able to stop thinking about something. So it's the consistency that makes it intrusive. Both can be a symptom of trauma.
Yeah, I've read a lot about the word ruminating.
Yes, or
right?
perseverating, yeah.
Yeah. So again, this list is really short, but I think it's helpful to us to be at least aware of when I am working and of trying to help somebody if they're exhibiting. Well, I'll give you an example. In my last church where I served, there was an elderly lady, and every time I spoke with her, she talked about her inability to sleep well. And had I known what I know now, I probably would have had a different conversation with her at times about her sleeplessness. My awareness now is I wondered if she was really not has yet to deal with the loss of her husband and was in some serious grief and didn't know how to move forward from that. So these are just things to be aware of when I hear someone talking about these different things that they're experiencing. How can I sit with them and encourage them or move them to resources that I don't have? One other thought here on this next slide about symptoms, and this is again from Dr. Kinsler in Tampa, that uh, you could look at this also from not just an individual, but sort of subgroups of people in community. So, for instance, at the bottom, symptoms in children. We'll talk about these things tomorrow. On Thursday, we'll talk about adults. So, as you read that, you can be thinking about that. That we'll talk about that on Thursday. At the top there, you see thoughts about more community minded, and we don't have the time to hit hard on that because we need to move along here. But Amanda touched on this a little bit earlier. Just what we've watched in our society in the last year and a half, a lot of that has to do with the community experience trauma. So I would encourage us to think whatever the community is of the ministry that you're in, the church, the community around your church, the community inside of your church. Um, that community has some symptoms of trauma that they're dealing with as a whole. To think through that, maybe encourage your leaders to sit down and just talk about that. What are those things? How can we minister to people and move them forward in the hurting that they have experienced? Let me just pause there before we get into some final thoughts here. Melissa or Amanda, you have any thoughts about this slide that you wanted to share? Okay, then we'll move on. I want to share our final list of thoughts from Hope Rising. And I just thought this was really helpful. And I'm just going to, it's 5 bullet points that they listed about what being trauma informed means. I'm just going to read these all together, 5 slides, and then ask Melissa and Amanda to share with us their thoughts on these 5 thoughts about what it means to be trauma informed. So, first of all, we are compassionate, kind, and loving and our responses to what children and adults have gone through. We don't blame or shame children or adults if we are sensitive to the trauma that they have experienced. We listen and let them share their pain and loss instead of trying to steer them to the one we want them to talk about and to put ourselves in their story. We try to help them see that they are not abnormal or suffering from a disorder because of the way they reacted to a very abnormal situation. And finally, we begin to help them find hope, move toward hope. Melissa, which any of those just sort of jump out to you like that one's really important?
I think not blaming and shaming is crucial because if we even accidentally do that, even if they still feel our compassion for them, it shuts people down pretty quickly. They're not going to trust that I'm a safe person to talk to if I've just made them feel ashamed or if as if they're to blame. And I think when that happens, I might be being too compassionate, too sympathetic. I need to remember that I'm sorry, this is their trauma, not my trauma. That's very key to helping.
Definitely. Amanda, any thoughts from this list?
I think they're all really good reminders. I was actually just looking through. The very first one just says, that we're compassionate, kind, and loving in our response. So I think that's something we've, in our preparation for this talked about too, is that although you're here as a ministry leader, no one's asking for you to become a mental health or a licensed counselor. There definitely is still a role for seeking out professional support. And so I think it can be kind of overwhelming to think like, oh, I have to listen to their story. I have to know what to say. And so to me, the word response, that could be a multitude of situations, right? It could be that they come to you with a different opinion about the way that the church is handling something. It could be that they need more support for their children in the children's ministry. You know what I mean? There's a variety of situations that may not speak directly to their trauma, but understanding that we have that ability to respond to them in a godly, loving, compassionate way, especially if we know some of what we've talked about today might be applicable about how they are seeing the world and how their past experiences might be impacting the decisions they're making today.
Definitely. It's really good. And by the way, listeners, I will forward this PowerPoint to you at the end of day 3. I'm going to send a guide to you of resources, everything we've talked about. I'll send you a guide that has all these resources, ways to link to them, and we will include the PowerPoint so they'll feel like I probably should have said that earlier. So if you're furiously writing things down, you don't necessarily have to do that. For our final couple of slides here, we want to just list some things that are suggestions to you so that you're not just hearing a lot of theory and definitions today, but also walk away with some helpful things. And this first one is as Amanda was just saying, these are some things, some questions you just have in your mind, sort of in your toolbox, you might say, that as you're talking with someone, you don't have to be in charge of the conversation. It's more about listening. And these questions can just be questions that you could help or have to help the conversation keep moving. What happened? How did it make you feel? And what was the hardest part for you? And that hashtag just listen seems to be the best reminder on the slide, to be a good listener. Melissa, as Amanda was just saying, we're not telling everybody you got to be licensed mental health counselors, but this seems to be helpful. What do you think about this list?
I really like all 3 of these questions used in the context of a conversation with someone. I do think it's important to know that what happened might be too direct a question for a lot of people, but couched in the midst of their story. Well, I can see that you're really upset about that. Is there anything you'd like to tell me about what happened to you or to them?
That's good. Yeah.
I think that's really good. But I think the just listen, you're right. That's really few words and a lot of ears.
Yeah. Give them permission to say whatever it is they want to say, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Just to be there. On this next slide, we have some particular thoughts for those that are in church leadership. And your title may not be pastor, it might be director, coordinator, whatever your title is. But from Trauma in America, they had some thoughts here that I think are really helpful for pastors. And maybe encourage, if you aren't the pastor of your church, share these thoughts with them as encouragement of, all right, I heard this trauma-informed material. How are we going to communicate with our people? And these are some really great thoughts about that, particularly number 1 and number 2. All of them are good, but just to keep the conversation moving or help people to find the resources that will help them do that, such as Samaritan or any other professional assistance that they could find. As you look at that, Amanda, any things that see like this could be really helpful in a church setting?
I think they're all great bullet points. And just, I would say the main thing is if you are going to say that help is available, to make sure you really follow up, because it's probably taking a lot of courage for the person to follow up on their end with seeking out your support. So just finding a way and making sure that process is aligned before you advertise it.
No doubt. Be ready, right? The final slide here, again from Trauma in America, is some thoughts just to encourage us about how to engage everyone and include scripture in it. And I'm not going to sit long on this so we can get to Q&A opportunities here. I did want to point out the second to the bottom, sign up for the long haul. As we've already alluded, you can't expect someone to walk through something in your timeline and understand it could be a while. And so just working with people at the pace where they are, and as you're involved in ministry, allow that process for God to lead that. And of course, let scripture be your guide in how you respond and how you bring the scripture to them. We're going to talk a lot tomorrow and on Thursday about the third bullet point there about being mindful of the marginalized as we talk about children and women and adults on Thursday. So I encourage you to try to keep your appointment and be here on Thursday.
John,
So,
can I mention something about that?
yeah,
The enter into others' pain. While I absolutely believe that's necessary, that's about compassion and caring. I just want to highlight that if we take that pain on as ours, we're going to damage ourselves and them. So enter into doesn't mean become absorbed with it. It
that's
means
great.
be present with them. To me, that's what it means.
Right. Like be present,
Yeah.
right? And not to try to do the other things of, move them on and not really listen. But your warning is good. You didn't say warning, but I'll say it's a warning. Don't create vicarious trauma for yourself, right?
Well said.
Right. All right, so our final slide here is just to help you to know how to connect with us at Samaritan, which is our phone numbers there, our website, SamaritanGulfCoast.com. If you want to connect with Melissa by email, she's given me permission to do that. You just use her name and put at SamaritanGulfCoast.com as the email address. And we're here to help you as a leader or people that you say, I got some people that in our ministry that we want to help get some professional assistance here. So we're going to take the next few minutes and see what we have in the Q&A. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. If you have one, now's the time to put it there. And Amanda just put her email address, by the way, in the chat box. So you have that there. I will have all of our panelists' email addresses on the resource guide that I will send out to you on Thursday afternoon. Linda, if you want to take yourself off mute here to see if there's any questions that came up or any comments that came up in the chat box. I'm just looking at some notes here. Anything that you have?
It was asked and you answered because the question came up about the slides. So
Okay.
that was helpful.
Oh, terrific. Well, I'm just going to hang out here for a minute or 60 seconds. So if you got
might
a question,
want to speak to what kind of resources one could expect.
okay. And we do have a question here in the Q&A. I'll see that, Nancy. I'll answer that in just a moment. The resources are all of the books and reports that you see listed in our PowerPoint today, and then again tomorrow and Thursday. Tomorrow we'll have time to share a video of a resource that Linda is actually going to be providing, and she'll share more about that. That's very specific for a group opportunity that people and churches could provide and participate in for healing trauma and be part of a group experience with that. So we're going to be sharing all of those things with you, as well as some podcasts, some videos to watch, articles to read, all those kinds of things. Nancy, it says, are cues available for this course? I may have just answered your question. I'm honestly not sure what you mean by are cues available for the course. Outside
CEUs
of
continue.
CEU.
Yeah.
Hello. Unfortunately, Nancy, we did not go down the road of securing those. Sorry, I now totally understand where you're coming from. I will say this, though. We're in the beginning stages of creating this webinar type content, And moving forward, we would definitely, Nancy, be looking into securing these as opportunities for you, whatever lane you're in, that you can secure those. So sorry, we did not set that up today for this series. That's a very good question, and a prompt for us to be looking into that. So we will be doing that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and sign off today. I just want to thank all of you for participating and registering. Feel free, please, to refer this to other people, as tomorrow we get more specific with the age group of children and adolescents. And on Thursday, as we talk with regarding ministry to adults, whether that's men, women, couples, different age groups, and generational stuff. So today's the only day Melissa's on for us. So thanks, Melissa, for stepping in today. Really, really good. I appreciate you doing it.
Thanks
Melissa.
for inviting me. I appreciate it. It was great to be here.
Yes, Amanda will be back tomorrow because she works with kids. That's her lane. So she's going to be back tomorrow with us, and we'll have a different panelist with us tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in, and we're going to sign off for now. And we will be, for those who have asked about recordings, again, we'll be putting this recordings on our YouTube channel as well. So thanks again. Have a good afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.